It's always nice to know that some things never change. There are things in this world that you can just count on being consistent, and that's great. Things like Newton's laws of motion and thermodynamics, Chick-fil-A being closed on Sundays, and Subaru's blowing their engine. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise that Subaru has been a bit of a punching bag in the car community due to their history of being a tad bit unreliable. But how is it that Subaru has become known for this? How have the cars maintained a cult following? And most of all, how has Subaru been able to get away with doing this for decades? Well, today we're going to be getting to the bottom of this, and while I am going to try to remain as unbiased as possible, you know, this video would be extremely boring without a few jabs at the flat earth believers of the car scene. So let's get into why Subaru engines blow up. Just like a 9th grade history class, we first need to start at the beginning, except this time instead of Mesopotamia, we're going to be looking at Japan in 1953. Fuji Heavy Industries, which found its roots in the Nakajima Aircraft Manufacturing Company, was making the Fuji Rabbit scooter and wanted to throw their hat in the ring to become an automobile manufacturer. The Subaru 1500, or otherwise known as the P1, was the first car manufactured as a prototype under Fuji Heavy Industries, starting in 1954. It was a 4-door, rear-wheel drive, compact sedan powered by a 1.5-liter inline 4-cylinder engine. Let me say that again. The first Subaru ever made had an inline 4-cylinder engine. But in the midst of all this, Fuji Heavy Industries, or Subaru, was working on developing a new engine for the Subaru 1500, an air-cooled boxer engine, the experimental EA51X. Sounds like a crazy gamer tag. Even though funding was tight and the engine never found its way into the Subaru 1500, it was the basis for the water-cooled EA52 boxer engine that was released in the front-wheel drive successor to the Subaru 1500, the Subaru 1000. But from there, the rest is pretty much history. Now, this is just the story of Subaru, and I think it's very important to note here that Subaru was not the first to use boxer engines in their vehicles. This was actually a very common thing at the time, especially in Europe with Volkswagen, Porsche, and Mercedes. And to this day, boxer engines remain relevant in the automotive and aviation space. So if that's the case, why has Subaru been the one to catch all the flack for their boxer engine? To understand, I think we need to take a look at some of the major problems Subaru has faced when it comes to putting these engines in their vehicles. The first problem that Subaru faces with their engines is the overall limitations and physical effects that go along with the boxer engine design. Gravity is the boxer engine's worst enemy. Getting oil to places that it needs to be and getting it out from places where it can't be is arguably one of the biggest problems that a boxer engine faces. In traditional engine layouts like an inline or V-shaped engine, fluids like oil will always find its way back down to the oil pan where it's meant to be stored, thanks to gravity and the design of the engine. In a horizontally opposed engine or a boxer engine, when it's turned off, since everything is flat, oil tends to sit in areas it shouldn't. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, it can lead to things like oil consumption or burning oil, and if that happens too much, it can lead to oil starvation. Older Subaru engines had much tighter tolerances when it comes to their components, and it used a heavier weight oil. This helped keep the engine's oil from getting into places like the combustion chamber and burning. On top of that, with the conventional oil that was being used back then, oil was being changed every 3,000 miles. So if there was any oil consumption happening, it wasn't really that noticeable since oil was being serviced so frequently. The only time this would become an issue is if components like gaskets or piston rings started to wear or fail, which don't worry, we'll talk about very soon here. However, to meet the recent efficiency requirements of the EPA, Subaru has had to make some changes to be more efficient to get better gas mileage. How do you make a boxer engine more efficient, especially when the majority of Subaru vehicles are all-wheel drive? One is to swap over to CVT transmissions to keep RPMs down on the highway, but that doesn't have anything to do with the engine itself or oil consumption. But what if the other way is to loosen up the tolerances in the engine and switch to a much lighter oil? Let's say something like, I don't know, 0W20, which is exactly what Subaru did. Looser tolerances and a lighter oil allow for less friction inside the engine, providing more efficiency. However, in turn, provides a perfect recipe for things like oil consumption. That whole thing alone is like a giant rabbit hole that we can go down, but we have other things to talk about. The other half of this issue is oil starvation. Obviously, if an engine isn't getting the proper lubrication to its components, bad things are going to happen. The EJ series of Subaru engines are notorious for their oiling issue. Under the forces of acceleration, braking, and hard turns, the oil pickups can be starved of oil, leading to catastrophic failures such as spun connecting rod or crankshaft bearing. And even though the EJ engines are the ones that made a name for this issue, it seems to be a recurring issue among many Subaru engines, including the FA24 and the new BRZ and GR86. Now, the elephant in the room is getting tired of waiting, so it's time to address him. When it comes to talking about Subaru engines and why they blow up, we of course have to talk about the common component failures that these engines are prone to. That's right, you knew it was coming. It was only a matter of time. it's time to talk about head gaskets and other problem areas, but first, head gaskets. Going back to the EG series engines, oil starvation wasn't their only issue. The head gaskets on the EJ25 are arguably the reason as to why the head gasket memes about Subaru exist in the first place. Originally, the head gaskets for these engines were made from a multi-layer composite material that was prone to failure pretty easily and pretty early on, causing either one of two things to happen: either coolant leaking out of the engine and causing it to overheat, or two, the head gasket would leak internally, causing oil and coolant to mix. Now, obviously, those two things don't mix well, water and oil. That's like basic science. Typically, between 90 and 150,000 miles is when these head gaskets are known to cause issues. And even though Subaru attempted to fix this issue around 1999 to 2000, it was still prevalent in some cars years after, up to around 2009. The good news is that for the most part, Subaru has been able to kind of get a grip on this one, and since like 2012, really hasn't been as big of a deal or a problem with the newer vehicles. However, the head gaskets are not the only component that we need to be worried about. There is another problem child that lies within these engines, and it goes by the name of oil control ring. We talked in the first part about the oil consumption issues that can be found in Subaru engines, and the oil control rings can play a crucial part in this issue. When you look at a piston from a Subaru engine, you'll find 3 rings on the piston. The top 2 are compression rings, and the bottom 3rd ring is the oil control ring. Now, the purpose of this ring is to essentially scrape the side of the cylinder walls to pull back the oil that is used for lubrication and keep it out of the combustion process so you're not burning oil. The problem with some of these oil control rings is that they are very thin, and the channels in them can get clogged up very easily with sludge over time, meaning that they can't get all the oil back to where it needs to be. This problem is made even worse with the Boxer engine design, since once again, the engine's flat and gravity doesn't help pull that oil back down. The 3rd issue is one that's actually a bit more recent and has been making headlines. That is the RTV issue with the newer FA series Subaru engines. This has been traced back to, once again, an oil starvation issue. It's claimed that too much RTV sealant is being used during engine assembly, and the excess is flaking off and finding its way into the engine's oil. And at the time of filming this video, there still has been no recall for this RTV issue that pretty much everyone is having to resolve themselves. And for those that did lose their engine to this, it seems like the majority have had to pay out of pocket to get a new engine. Now, I just put a lot of blame in the hands of Subaru for what goes on with their engines. However, it's only fair to recognize the accountability that we as the owners and drivers of these vehicles need to take for a good number of these engines blowing up as well. I'm of course talking about what happens when we start modifying these cars and their engines and the risks that come along with it. The Subaru WRX alone is one of the most popular cars in the world when it comes to modifications. The combination of a Japanese tuner car with 4 cylinders, a turbocharger, all-wheel drive make them extremely popular. And it should be no surprise that some of these cars are getting up there in age. Demanding more power from an engine that needs maintenance more than anything is a surefire way to wind up with an expensive lawn ornament. Inexperience, parts, bad tunes, and neglect are the final nails in the coffin for many of these cars and their engines. So while Subaru definitely has some things to figure out, it still would be wrong to put the blame entirely on them, as I've seen what some of you guys and gals do to your cars. This oily and vape juice flavored recipe has been the cause for many heated conversations, not only on the internet, but in person, on whether or not Subarus are good cars. Fact of the matter is, these cars remain extremely popular, and the people that love them are not going to stop backing them and modifying. The truth is, they can be extremely capable cars, and the Boxer engine itself, from an engineering standpoint, does actually kind of make a lot of sense and can be done well. So whether it's the aftermarket support for these cars, the power that can be made, or just the exhaust note in general, people will stand by Subaru and the Boxer engine. But if you have a Subaru that's not blown up, or it is blown up and you need some new parts for it, don't forget you can mod your car or any other car at Martini Works. I'm Giles. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.